He froze, his 3 sons laughing, soaking wet inside his kitchen sink, her hands in the water. And in that second, everything he thought he controlled shattered. Brian Churchill was a 45-year-old widower who hadn't been home in 2 weeks. 18 months ago, his wife died. Just like that, no warning. And he did what broken men do. When grief becomes unbearable, he ran. Not physically, but emotionally, he disappeared. He hired nannies to raise his 3-year-old triplets, Jason, James, and John. He worked constantly, traveled endlessly, convinced himself that providing was the same as being present. But deep down, he knew the truth. His sons barely recognized him anymore. It was a cold October night when he came home 3 days early from London. No warning, no phone call. The house was quiet when he walked in just after 9. Everything in its place, perfect, empty. And then he heard it. Laughter. Wild, uncontrolled laughter, coming from the kitchen. His heart stopped. The boys were supposed to be asleep. Routines were sacred. But this wasn't routine. Brian followed the sound, his shoes squeaking on the floor, until he reached the kitchen door. And when he pushed it open, everything stopped. Grace Jackson, the housekeeper he'd hired 6 months ago, was standing at his kitchen sink with all 3 of his sons inside it. Water everywhere, bubbles everywhere, and they were laughing like he hadn't heard them laugh since their mother died. For a moment, Brian couldn't breathe, because James, the one who screamed during every bath, was giggling. And this woman, this stranger, was doing something he'd completely forgotten how to do. She was making them feel safe. Brian stood frozen in that doorway, watching his sons come alive in someone else's hands. And for the first time in 18 months, he felt something crack open inside his chest. Something between grief and hope. Before we begin, like, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because sometimes God uses the most unexpected people to remind us what love really looks like. 2 hours earlier, Grace Jackson stood in the kitchen, phone pressed against her ear, trying not to cry. "I got in, Grace. I actually got in." Her baby brother's voice was shaking on the other end. Excited, scared, hopeful. "That's amazing, Marcus," she whispered, gripping the counter. "I'm so proud of you. But the tuition, the books, I don't know how I'm gonna." "Don't worry about that," Grace cut him off, even though her stomach twisted. "We'll figure it out. We always do." When she hung up, she stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing. Marcus was 18, first person in their family to get into college, and she had no idea how she was going to help him pay for it. Grace was 30, oldest of 6 kids, raised in a cramped apartment on Chicago's South Side, where her mama worked night shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on. Grace had been the one who made sure her brothers and sisters got to school, the one who cooked dinner, the one who stayed up when they were scared. She'd had dreams once, teaching maybe, something that mattered, but bills don't wait for dreams. So when this job came up 6 months ago, good pay, room and board, working for some tech billionaire in Connecticut, she took it. She was supposed to clean, stay out of the way, back up childcare, they said, occasionally. But occasionally turned into every night. Because the nannies Mr. Churchill hired didn't care about those boys. Not really. They followed schedules, kept things quiet, made sure the house stayed perfect. But Jason, James, and John, they weren't perfect. They were sad. And Grace knew what sad looked like in a child's eyes. "Grace?" She turned. James was standing in the doorway in his pajamas, clutching his stuffed bear, tears streaming down his face. "Hey, baby." She knelt down. "What's wrong?" "Miss Angela left," he whispered. "She said she's not coming back." Grace's jaw tightened. "Another one? That was the 3rd nanny this month. And it's bath time." James's voice cracked. "I don't want to go upstairs." Grace's heart broke. James had slipped in the big bathtub 2 months ago, hit his head. Ever since then, he screamed every time they tried to bathe him up there. The nannies would force him anyway, holding him down while he cried, saying it was for his own good. Grace hated it. "Come here." She pulled him close, feeling his little body shake. "What if we don't use the big tub tonight?" He looked up at her, confused. "But Mr. Churchill says..." "Mr. Churchill's not here," Grace said gently. "And you know what? I think we can make bath time fun. You trust me?" James nodded. 10 minutes later, all 3 boys were in the kitchen sink. Grace had filled it with warm water and bubbles. She rolled up her sleeves, put on some old Motown song her mama used to sing, and turned the whole thing into a game. Jason wanted a bubble beard. John wanted to be a sea captain. And James? James was laughing. Actually laughing. Grace stood there with her hands in the water, singing, making up silly voices, and watching these 3 little boys forget just for a moment that they were sad. And that's when the door opened. That's when Brian Churchill walked in. That's when Grace's whole world stopped. Because the look on his face wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was grief. For a moment, nobody moved. Grace stood frozen at the sink, water dripping from her hands. The boys turned toward the doorway, eyes wide. "Daddy," Jason said it first. Then all 3 of them scrambled out of the sink, soaking wet, running straight to him. Brian dropped to his knees without thinking, catching them as they crashed into him. Their wet pajamas soaked through his suit, but he didn't care. He wrapped his arms around all 3 at once, holding them tighter than he had in months. "I missed you," he whispered, his voice rough. "You're home early," John said, pulling back to look at him. "Are you staying?" Brian hesitated. "Yeah, I'm staying. Can you hear the jungle story?" James tugged on his sleeve. "Grace tells it every night. There's a lion and a moon and—" "Okay, okay." Grace's voice cut through gently. She was drying her hands on a towel, not quite meeting Brian's eyes. "Bath time's over. Let's get you boys into bed." "But Daddy just got here," Jason protested. "And Daddy will still be here in the morning," Grace said, her tone kind but firm. "Come on, let's go." The boys groaned but obeyed, trailing after her toward the stairs. Brian stood slowly, watching them go. At the doorway, Grace paused, turned back. "Mr. Churchill," her voice was steady, but he could see tension in her shoulders. "I can explain." "After they're asleep," Brian said quietly. "Meet me in the study." She nodded and disappeared down the hall. 30 minutes later, Grace knocked on the study door. "Come in." She stepped inside, her hair pulled back now, her shirt changed. Professional, guarded. Brian was standing by the window, looking out at the rain. He didn't turn around. "The kitchen sink," he said. Grace took a breath. "James is terrified of the bathtub upstairs. He slipped 2 months ago. Ever since then, he screams every time we try to. So, you put all 3 of them in my kitchen sink?" "Yes." Brian finally turned. His face was unreadable. "That's not protocol." "No," Grace said. "It's not. The nannies I hire follow specific procedures. There are bathrooms upstairs for a reason." Grace met his gaze. "With respect, Mr. Churchill, your procedures were making your son cry himself to sleep every night." The words hung in the air. Brian's jaw tightened. "You're saying I don't know what's best for my own children. I'm saying James needed to feel safe." Grace's voice softened. "And in that kitchen, with me right there, he did, for the first time in weeks." Brian stared at her, and for just a second, something in his expression cracked. "When's the last time you gave them a bath?" Grace asked quietly. The question landed like a punch. Brian looked away. "I provide them with everything they need. Everything except you." Silence. Brian walked to his desk, gripping the edge of it. His knuckles went white. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice low. "To look at them and see her, to feel like every time you try, you're just failing." Grace's expression softened. "Maybe, but they don't need you to be perfect, Mr. Churchill. They just need you to be there." Brian closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, his voice was quieter, vulnerable. "Show me," he said. "Tomorrow night. Show me what you do." Grace blinked, surprised. "You want to join bath time?" "I want to understand." She nodded slowly. "Okay." As she turned to leave, Brian called after her. "Miss Jackson." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for being there when I wasn't." Grace looked back at him, something sad and hopeful in her eyes. "They're waiting for you to be there too." And then she was gone. The next evening, Brian came home at 6. The boys were in the kitchen with Grace when he walked in. They looked up from their coloring books, shocked. "Daddy?" John's crayon stopped mid-stroke. "You're home." "I said I would be." Brian set his briefcase down, feeling awkward in his own house. "What are you guys doing?" "Coloring." Jason held up a page covered in wild purple scribbles. "Look, it's a dinosaur." Brian studied it. That's very creative. Grace glanced at him from the stove. Dinner's almost ready. Chicken nuggets and mac and cheese. Can I help? She paused, surprised, then nodded. Sure. Can you cut up those apples? Thin slices. James won't eat them if they're chunky. Brian moved to the counter, picked up the knife, and started cutting. Too thick. He tried again. Thinner, Grace said gently, stepping beside him. Like this. Her hand guided his for just a second. Then she pulled back. Got it, Brian muttered. Jason giggled. Daddy doesn't know how to cook. Then I guess I need to learn, Brian said. Dinner was chaos. Spilled milk. Arguments over who got the blue plate. Jason singing with his mouth full. John dropping a nugget on the floor and picking it up to eat it anyway. Brian watched Grace handle it all with ease, redirecting, laughing, keeping things moving without ever raising her voice. He felt completely out of place, but he stayed. At 7:30, Grace led the boys to the kitchen. Bath time, she announced. James's face fell. In the sink again? If that's okay with your dad. 3 pairs of eyes turned to Brian. He cleared his throat. Yeah, the sink's fine. James's whole body relaxed. Grace filled the sink with warm water, added bubbles, and lifted James in first. I'm right here, buddy. James smiled. Brian stood back, watching, still unsure. Want to help with Jason? Grace asked. Brian stepped forward. Jason looked up at him, waiting. Okay, Brian said, his hands stiff. Let's get you in there. He lifted Jason carefully, like he might break. Set him down in the bubbles next to James. It's warm, Daddy, Jason said. Good. That's good. Grace handed him a washcloth. Just wash his hair, make it fun. Brian wet Jason's hair, applied shampoo. His hands were clumsy, uncertain, and then by accident he made the soap stand up in a mohawk. John burst out laughing. Jason looks like a punk rocker. Brian blinked. Then something loosened in his chest. He leaned into it. Yeah? What about this? He sculpted James's hair into spikes. The boys dissolved into giggles. Do, John! Do, John! They shouted. Brian made John's hair stick straight up. All 3 boys were laughing so hard they could barely breathe. And Brian, for the first time in 18 months, laughed with them. Really laughed. Grace stepped back, watching, a small smile on her face. This was what they needed. What he needed. After the boys were asleep, Brian found Grace cleaning the kitchen. Water was everywhere, towels in a pile. He grabbed one and started drying the counter. You don't have to. I want to. They worked in silence for a moment. Then Brian spoke, his voice quiet. I haven't heard them laugh like that since Catherine died. Grace stopped wiping. They've been waiting for you. I thought I was doing the right thing, giving them stability, the best of everything. You were protecting yourself, Grace said gently. But they don't need protection from you. They need you. Brian set the towel down, his throat tight. When it's just us, call me Brian. Grace looked at him. Then call me Grace. Something shifted between them. Small, fragile, but real. That night, Brian stood outside the boys' room, listening to them sleep talk about Daddy's funny bubbles. His chest ached. But this time, it didn't feel like grief. It felt like something thawing. 2 weeks passed. Brian came home every night by 6, sometimes earlier. He cancelled trips, rescheduled meetings, told his assistant that his evenings were no longer negotiable. The boys noticed. They started running to the door when they heard his car. Started asking, Is Daddy coming to dinner? Started including him in their games. And Brian? He started learning. That James needed his toast cut into triangles. That Jason's stuffed elephant had to sit on the left side of his pillow. That John hummed when he was thinking hard about something. Small things, things a father should know. Grace watched it all happen, watched Brian slowly come back to life, watched the distance between him and his sons shrink a little more each day. And somewhere in the middle of bubble baths and bedtime stories, something else started happening. Something neither of them said out loud. The way Brian's hand would brush hers when they were folding laundry. The way Grace would catch him looking at her across the kitchen. The way they'd linger in the doorway after the boys fell asleep, talking about nothing and everything. It scared her, because she knew it couldn't last. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. Grace was in the garden with the boys when her phone rang. Her sister's name flashed on the screen. Hey, Maya. What's? Grace, we need help. Her stomach dropped. What happened? Marcus got into college, full acceptance, but we can't afford it. And Mama's hospital just sent another bill. We're 3 months behind on rent. I don't know what to do. Grace closed her eyes. The boys were laughing behind her, chasing butterflies. She could hear their joy, their safety. How much do you need? 15,000, at least. Grace, I'm sorry. I know you're doing everything you can, but I'll figure it out. When she hung up, she stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. $15,000. She did the math in her head. Her salary barely covered it. She'd have to take a second job, which meant leaving Connecticut, which meant leaving them. That night, Grace was quiet during dinner. Grace, are you sad? Jason asked, tilting his head. She forced a smile. No, baby. Just tired. But Brian saw through it. After the boys were asleep, he found her in the kitchen. What's wrong? Nothing. Just family stuff. Grace. She looked up at him, and for a moment, she almost told him, almost let herself lean on someone else for once. But then she remembered who he was, what she was. He was a billionaire. She was the help. It's fine, she said. I can handle it. Brian didn't push, but the worry stayed in his eyes. Late that night, Grace sat at the small desk in her room above the garage. She pulled out a piece of paper, stared at it for a long time. Then she started writing. Dear Mr. Churchill, it is with deep regret that I must resign my position, effective 2 weeks from today. Her hand shook. This has been the most meaningful work of my life. Your sons will always hold a piece of my heart. Tears fell onto the paper. But my family needs me, and I cannot be in 2 places at once. She signed it, folded it, left it on his desk before she could change her mind. The next morning, Grace went through the motions, made breakfast, played with the boys, pretended her heart wasn't breaking, and at noon, Brian found the letter. He read it once, twice, 3 times. Then he sat down at his desk, the letter crumpled in his fist, and realized something that terrified him. This wasn't just about the boys anymore. He needed her too. Brian cancelled his afternoon meetings. He sat in his study, staring at Grace's resignation letter, and felt something inside him collapse. Effective 2 weeks from today. 2 weeks. 14 days before his sons lost the only person who'd made them feel safe again. Before they went back to being quiet, withdrawn, alone. Before he lost. Brian stopped himself. But the thought had already surfaced, and once it was there, he couldn't push it back down. This wasn't just about the boys. He found her in the garden that afternoon. The boys were napping. Grace was sitting on the bench under the oak tree, staring at nothing. She didn't hear him approach. Grace. She turned, startled, stood up quickly. Mr. Churchill, I was just... Why didn't you tell me? She froze. Brian held up the letter. Your family, the money. Why didn't you say anything? Grace looked away. Because it's not your problem. Not my... Brian stopped himself, took a breath. You're leaving because you need $15,000. I'm leaving because my family needs me. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain underneath. My brother got into college. My mama's drowning in medical bills. I'm the oldest. This is what I do. So you're just going to walk away? From the boys? From... He stopped. From what? Grace's eyes met his. Brian didn't answer. Couldn't. Because what was he supposed to say? That somewhere between bubble baths and midnight conversations she'd become essential? That the thought of her leaving felt like losing Catherine all over again? He had no right. They need you, he said finally. They need you more. Grace's voice cracked. You're their father, Brian. I'm just... Don't. The word came out harder than he meant. Don't say you're just anything. Grace stared at him. You saved them, Brian said quietly. You saved me. And I'm not letting you walk away because you think you have to choose between your family and mine. What are you saying? Brian pulled an envelope from his jacket. I made some calls this morning. Your brother's tuition is covered. All 4 years. Room and board, books, everything. Grace's hand went to her mouth. Brian, I can't. It's already done. Anonymous donation. His school doesn't even know it came from me. Why would you do that? Because I'm selfish. Brian's voice was raw. Because the thought of you leaving... He stopped. Started again. Because you gave my sons something I couldn't. Joy, safety, love. And I'm asking you, begging you to stay. Tears streamed down Grace's face. Not as an employee, Brian continued. As family, I want to make you their legal guardian. His voice broke. I want you to stay. Grace covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Brian took a step closer. Please. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she looked up at him, tears still falling. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. Brian exhaled, relief flooding through him. But neither of them saw the Mercedes pulling through the gates. Neither of them knew that everything was about to get much harder. Saturday morning. Brian was in the kitchen with Grace and the boys, making pancakes, flour everywhere, Jason's hands covered in batter, John trying to flip one and nearly dropping it on the floor. Laughter, warmth, the kind of morning Brian never thought he'd have again. Then the doorbell rang. Grace looked up. Were you expecting someone? Brian frowned. No. He walked to the front door, wiping flour from his hands. When he opened it, his blood went cold. Patricia, Catherine's mother, stood on the doorstep, perfectly dressed, her eyes sharp as glass. Hello, Brian. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I was in the area. Thought I'd visit my grandsons. Brian's jaw tightened. You should have called. Should I need permission to see my own family? She walked past him toward the kitchen, her heels clicking on the floor. And when she stepped into the kitchen doorway, she stopped. Brian, wearing an apron. Grace at the stove. The boys covered in flour, giggling on the counter. Patricia's expression didn't change, but her eyes said everything. The rest of the morning was unbearable. Patricia stayed, watched everything, criticized the boys' table manners, mentioned how Catherine would have handled things differently, asked pointed questions about Grace's responsibilities. Grace stayed quiet, professional, but Brian could see her pulling back, building walls. That evening, after the boys were in bed, Patricia cornered Brian in his study. We need to talk. Brian closed his laptop. About what? About her. Her name is Grace. Patricia's eyes narrowed. I'm aware. I'm also aware that she's become far too comfortable in this house. The boys cling to her, Brian. It's inappropriate. She's good for them. Or she's creating a dependency that will devastate them when she leaves. Because people like her always leave. Brian stood. What's that supposed to mean? You know exactly what it means. Patricia's voice was cold. She's the help, Brian. Let's not pretend this is something it isn't. You're a widower. You're vulnerable. And she's taking advantage of that. That's not. What do you really know about her? Her background? Her intentions? I know she loves my sons. Or she loves your money. Patricia leaned forward. Catherine has been gone barely 18 months, and you're allowing some woman to insert herself into your children's lives, into your life. Think about what you're doing. In the hallway, Grace stood frozen. She'd been bringing fresh towels for the guest room, but when she heard her name, she stopped. People like her always leave. She's the help. Taking advantage. The words cut deeper than anything she'd felt in years, because part of her had started to believe she belonged here, that maybe she wasn't just the housekeeper, that maybe Brian saw her as something more. But Patricia's voice was a mirror, showing Grace the truth she'd been trying to ignore. She didn't belong in this world. She never would. Grace set the towels on the hall table and walked away, her chest so tight she couldn't breathe. Inside the study, Brian's voice was low, firm. Grace is staying. As family. I'm making her the boys' legal guardian. Patricia's face went pale. You cannot be serious. I've never been more serious about anything. Then you're a fool. Patricia grabbed her purse and walked to the door. Paused. This will end badly, Brian. And when it does, don't say I didn't warn you. She left. Brian sat alone in the silence, his chest heavy. He didn't know Grace had heard. He didn't know the damage was already done. The next morning, something was different. Grace was in the kitchen when Brian came down. She had breakfast ready. The boys were eating. Everything looked normal, but it wasn't. Good morning, Brian said. Good morning, Mr. Churchill. Her voice was polite, distant. Mr. Churchill, not Brian. He felt the shift immediately, like a door had closed between them. The rest of the day was the same. Grace stayed professional, did her job, played with the boys. But there was a wall now, something she'd put up overnight that Brian couldn't reach through. At dinner, he tried. Grace, about yesterday, my mother-in-law. It's fine. She didn't look at him. She has every right to be concerned about her grandchildren. That's not what I... Excuse me, I need to start their bath. She left the room before he could finish. That night, Grace stood at the kitchen sink, the same sink where everything had started, and felt her heart breaking. She'd been foolish. So foolish. For 2 weeks, she'd let herself believe in something that didn't exist, that she could be part of this family, that Brian saw her as more than just the help. But Patricia's words had torn that illusion apart. She's the help, Brian. Let's not pretend this is something it isn't. Grace looked down at her hands in the soapy water and realized the truth. No matter how much the boys loved her, no matter how much she'd started to feel at home here, she would never truly belong. Not in this world. Not in his world. Upstairs, the boys sensed it too. "Why is Grace sad?" James whispered to Brian during story time. "I don't know, buddy. Did we do something wrong?" "No, you didn't do anything wrong." But John climbed into Brian's lap, looking up at him with worried eyes. "Is Grace leaving?" Brian's throat tightened. "No, she's not leaving." "Promise?" "I promise." But even as he said it, Brian felt the lie in his chest, because something had changed, and he didn't know how to fix it. Late that night, Brian stood outside Grace's door above the garage. He raised his hand to knock, then stopped. What could he say? That he'd defended her to Patricia? That didn't erase the words Grace must have heard. That didn't change the reality of who they were. A billionaire and his housekeeper. 2 different worlds that had collided for a moment, but were never meant to stay together. Brian lowered his hand, walked back to the house alone, and neither of them slept that night, both staring at the ceiling in separate rooms, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on their chests. Grace thought about leaving again, packing her bags, disappearing before this hurt any worse. Brian thought about how empty the house would feel without her, how quiet the boys would become, how much he'd come to need her presence in ways he couldn't admit. And outside, the night stretched on, cold, dark, heavy with the kind of silence that comes right before everything falls apart. Sunday afternoon, Patricia insisted on hosting lunch. A proper meal, she said, with proper company. She invited a family from her country club, set the table with china, made everything formal and cold. The boys sat quietly, uncomfortable in their stiff clothes. Grace was in the kitchen, told to assist with serving. Brian hated it, but he didn't know how to fight his mother-in-law without making things worse. Patricia served pasta. Expensive, elegant, with shellfish. Grace was clearing plates when she saw it. Her blood went cold. "Mrs. Whitmore," she stepped forward quickly. "James can't eat that. He's allergic to shellfish." Patricia waved her off. "A little exposure builds immunity. My doctor friend told me so." "No," Grace's voice was firm. "He's severely allergic. Please don't. I think I know what's best for my grandson." Grace looked at Brian. He was about to speak when Patricia cut him off. "Grace, you're overstepping." Again. Grace backed away, her hands shaking, and James took a bite. 5 minutes later, James started scratching his throat. "Mummy." He stopped, looked confused. "Grace, my throat feels weird." Grace was at his side instantly. Hives were breaking out on his arms. His breathing was getting shallow. "James?" Brian stood, panic rising. "What's wrong?" "He's having an allergic reaction." Grace's voice was calm, but her hands moved fast. She pulled an EpiPen from her apron pocket. She'd been carrying it for months, just in case. Patricia went pale. "What are you?" Grace didn't answer. She administered the injection, steady and sure, then pulled out her phone. "This is Grace Jackson. I need an ambulance." 3-year-old boy. Severe allergic reaction. EpiPen administered. "Yes, he's breathing. We're at." Brian couldn't move, couldn't think. Just watched Grace hold James, keeping him calm, whispering to him, "You're okay, baby. I've got you. Just breathe with me. In and out." James clung to her. "Grace, scared." "I know, but you're safe. I promise." The ambulance came. Grace rode with James. Brian followed with Jason and John. At the hospital, the doctor pulled them aside. "You saved his life. Another few minutes and this could have been much worse." James was in a bed, recovering, and he wouldn't let go of Grace's hand. Jason and John sat on either side of her, pressed close. Brian stood in the doorway, watching, and something inside him shattered. This woman his mother-in-law had called the help, had been prepared, had carried an EpiPen for months against everyone's advice, had known his son better than anyone, had saved his life. Patricia appeared beside him, her face pale with guilt. She looked at Grace holding James, at the way all three boys clung to her. "I was wrong," Patricia whispered. Brian didn't respond, because he was done listening to anyone's opinion about Grace. Later, in the hospital cafeteria, Brian sat across from Grace. She looked exhausted, shaken. "I found your resignation letter," he said quietly. Grace looked down. "Brian, I'm not accepting it. Your mother-in-law made it very clear where I stand. I don't care what she thinks." Brian leaned forward. "Grace, you saved my son's life today, but more than that, you've been saving all of us since the day you got here." Tears filled her eyes. "Stay," Brian said. "Please, not because I'm asking you to, because you want to, because you're family." Grace's voice broke. "People like me don't belong in families like yours. Then maybe I've been in the wrong family." Brian reached across the table, took her hand. "Maybe the right family is the one you choose, the one that chooses you back." Grace stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "I'm staying," she whispered, and for the first time in days, Brian breathed. 6 months later, spring came to Connecticut, bringing warmth after a long winter. The Churchill estate looked different now. Toys scattered on the lawn, drawings taped to the fridge, laughter echoing through rooms that used to feel like a museum. Brian had restructured everything, came home by 5 every day, no weekend travel, no more running. The boys were different too, louder, happier, more alive. And Grace? She was still there, not as the housekeeper, not as the help, as family. One evening, Brian stood in the kitchen doorway, watching. Grace was at the sink, the same sink where everything had started giving the boys their bath. They were 4 now, still giggling, still splashing, still turning bath time into an adventure. But this time, Brian didn't just watch. He walked over, rolled up his sleeves, joined them. "Daddy, you're getting soaked," John squealed. "That's the point, isn't it?" Brian grinned, making bubble beards on all 3 boys. Grace caught his eye and smiled. And in that moment, Brian realized something. He'd spent 18 months trying to control everything, trying to keep the grief at bay by staying busy, by keeping his distance, by doing everything the right way. But Grace had shown him something different, that sometimes love means getting messy, means breaking your own rules, means showing up even when you're scared of getting it wrong. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, Brian and Grace sat on the back porch. The air was warm. The stars were out. "Jason drew another picture today," Grace said softly. "Yeah? 5 people this time. You, me, and the boys. He titled it, 'My Family.'" Brian's throat tightened. "Is that what we are?" Grace looked at him. "I think so, don't you?" Brian nodded. "Yeah, I think we are." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Grace spoke quietly. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think God knew exactly what he was doing, bringing me here, to this house, to your boys." She paused. "To you." Brian reached over, took her hand. "I think Catherine would have liked you." "Yeah?" "Yeah. She always said the best things in life come when you're not looking for them, when you stop trying to control everything and just let Grace in." Grace smiled, tears in her eyes. "Grace, that's ironic. Maybe. Or maybe it's exactly how it was supposed to be." The next morning, Brian came downstairs to find chaos in the kitchen. Grace was making pancakes with the boys, flour everywhere, batter on the counters, music playing. Pure, beautiful mess. Grace looked up, caught him watching, and laughed. "Don't just stand there. We need help." Brian walked over, and as he stepped into the noise and the laughter and the mess, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Complete, not because everything was perfect, but because everyone he loved was right there, present, laughing, together. That evening, Patricia called. "How are my grandsons?" she asked, her voice softer than it used to be. "They're good, happy." A pause. Then, "And Grace, is she still there?" "She is." "Good." Patricia's voice cracked slightly. "That's good, Brian. Catherine would be proud of you." When Brian hung up, he stood there for a moment, letting those words settle. Then he walked into the living room where Grace was reading to the boys. He sat down beside them. James crawled into his lap. Jason leaned against Grace. John sprawled across both of them, And Brian closed his eyes, listening to Grace's voice, feeling his son's weight against him, and whispered a prayer he hadn't prayed in months. Thank you for second chances, for grace that shows up when you need it most, for family that finds you even when you've stopped looking, for love that heals, for coming home. Sometimes the people who save us aren't the ones we expect. Sometimes grace walks through your door, wearing an apron and carrying hope you didn't know you needed. Sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who loves you through the mess. Brian Churchill learned that the hard way, but he learned. And in a kitchen where 3 little boys once learned to laugh again, a broken man learned something too. That being a good father isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's about love. It's about grace. If this story touched something deep in your soul, I want to hear from you. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you believe in second chances. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had someone walk into your life and change everything? Share this with someone who needs to know that healing is possible, that grace is real, that sometimes God uses the most unexpected people to put broken families back together. Because maybe, just maybe, this story found you for a reason.